There are certain forces you should never mess with in life: the Italian mafia, the IRS, and especially a farmer who understands the law. But Karen, our powerful HOA president, failed to realize this when she decided to ban my reliable old tractor from the road leading to my farm, a road my family had been using for over 40 years. She clearly never heard the saying, "Don't mess with the person who grows your food." Are you watching this video from a neighborhood with an HOA nightmare of your own? Drop a comment right now if you've ever had to deal with a Karen like the one I'm about to tell you about. The whole mess started 3 months after I inherited my family's small farm following my father's passing. While only 5 acres, the land had been in our family for generations, long before the fancy Oak Ridge Estate subdivision was even a blueprint. The property had supported my family through good times and bad, and now it was my responsibility to keep it producing. I had big plans to modernize our operations, starting with some new agricultural equipment that had just been delivered. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when I was driving my father's old Massey Ferguson tractor along the Eastern Access Road, the same road we'd always used to bring equipment to and from the main county highway. The road technically ran along the edge of Oak Ridge Estates before reaching my property, but we had a documented easement dating back to when the development was first built. I was hauling a new tiller attachment when I spotted a luxury SUV parked sideways across the road, blocking my path completely. Next to it stood a woman in her early 50s with an expensive haircut, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and a phone pointed directly at me. "Excuse me," I called out, cutting the tractor's engine. "Your vehicle is blocking the access road to my farm." The woman's face transformed into what I can only describe as the universal "I want to speak to your manager" expression. "This is private HOA property and industrial equipment is strictly prohibited on our roads," she announced, still recording me with her phone. "I'm Karen Patterson, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and I'm going to have to ask you to turn that thing around immediately." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Ms. Patterson, I understand your concern, but this road has a legal easement for access to my property. My family has been using it since before Oak Ridge was built." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet, producing a laminated card with the easement reference number that my father had always kept handy. "You're welcome to check the county records, but I have every legal right to use this access road." Karen's expression hardened as she barely glanced at the card. "Well, I've never seen that before, and regardless, the HOA has jurisdiction over all roads in our community. The rules clearly state that no vehicles over 3 tons are permitted, and that monstrosity clearly exceeds that limit." She stepped closer to my tractor, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what this does to our property values? People pay premium prices to live in a clean, quiet neighborhood without farm equipment rumbling past their homes." I noticed a few curious residents watching from their driveways. "Miss Patterson, I'm just trying to get to my farm. This is how I make my living. If you'll just move your vehicle—" "I've already called the sheriff," she interrupted, waving her phone triumphantly. "You can explain your easement to him." 20 minutes later, Sheriff Martinez arrived. To my relief, he was familiar with the area and its history. He examined my easement documentation, nodded, and then pulled Karen aside for a conversation. I couldn't hear everything, but phrases like "established right-of-ways" and "legally binding" drifted my way. Karen's face grew increasingly red as the sheriff spoke. Finally, he walked back to me. "You're free to proceed, Mr. Reynolds," he said. "The road will be cleared immediately." Karen stormed back to her SUV, but not before stopping directly in front of me. "This isn't over," she hissed. "The HOA bylaws can be amended, and believe me, they will be. Enjoy your tractor ride for now." She climbed into her vehicle and reversed with unnecessary aggression, tires squealing as she pulled away. Sheriff Martinez watched her go and shook his head. "Be careful with that one, Mike. Karen's been stirring up trouble since she became HOA president 3 years ago. Folks say nobody else wanted the job, but she treats it like she's running a small country." I thanked him, restarted my tractor, and continued to my farm, but the knot in my stomach told me this was just the beginning. Sure enough, 3 days later I received an official letter in my mailbox announcing an emergency HOA meeting to discuss new regulations regarding heavy equipment and agricultural vehicles on community roads. When I checked the date, I realized they had deliberately scheduled it for a time when most working people couldn't attend, 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. As I held the meeting notice in my hand, I knew this was only the opening act. I had never played HOA politics before, but fortunately I had an advantage that Karen was completely unaware of, and that was the beginning of a game she would regret starting. I arrived 20 minutes early for the HOA meeting, parking my pickup truck, not my tractor. I wasn't looking to antagonize anyone unnecessarily, at the far end of the community center lot. I watched as Karen worked the room before the meeting officially started, moving from person to person with a stack of papers, nodding emphatically as she spoke. Classic lobbying. I recognized James Wilson, the owner of a local hardware store, and HOA vice president, looking uncomfortable as Karen spoke to him, glancing my way several times during their conversation. The community center meeting room filled quickly with Oak Ridge residents, most of whom gave me curious sideways glances. I was clearly the outsider here, in my work boots and flannel shirt, among a sea of business casual attire. Karen had positioned herself at the head table with the other HOA board members, a gavel placed prominently in front of her. At precisely 2 p.m., she struck it against the wooden block with unnecessary force. "I call this emergency meeting of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association to order," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who enjoyed wielding power. "As many of you are aware, we have a serious situation developing regarding unauthorized industrial equipment traversing our neighborhood roads. For those who haven't been affected yet, let me paint you a picture of what some of your neighbors have been forced to endure." What followed was 15 minutes of the most dramatic exaggeration I'd ever witnessed. Karen described my occasional tractor trips as constant disruptions that were endangering children, damaging road surfaces, and decimating property values. She produced blown-up photographs of my tractor with red circles highlighting innocuous mud spots on the tires as though they were toxic waste. One resident, who I later learned was Karen's close friend, stood to describe how her toddler had been traumatized by the terrifying noise of my machine. When Karen finally opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand immediately. She pretended not to see me for several minutes, calling on 4 other residents who expressed varying degrees of concern, clearly influenced by her presentation. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she acknowledged me. "Thank you, Ms. Patterson," I said, standing and addressing the room. "I'm Mike Reynolds, owner of Sunset Hill Farm, which has been in my family for 3 generations. First, I want to say that I understand everyone's concerns about safety and property values. Those matter to me too. My property borders yours, after all." I pulled out a folder and removed several documents. What seems to have been overlooked is that my farm has a legal easement for access via the Eastern Road. This easement was established when Oak Ridge was developed and is recorded with the county. I held up the documents. "I have copies here for anyone who'd like to review them." Karen interrupted before I could continue. "Mr. Reynolds, while your historical documentation is interesting, it doesn't supersede the HOA's authority to establish rules for our community roads. The board has prepared a proposed amendment to our bylaws that would address this issue while respecting all legal requirements." She held up a document of her own. "The proposed regulation would establish weight limits of 10,000 pounds for any vehicle using HOA roads, with special permits required for exceptions. This is completely within our legal rights and doesn't violate your easement. It simply regulates the type of vehicles that can use it." I felt my face flush as I realized what she was doing. My tractor weighed well over 10,000 pounds, as did most of the delivery trucks that serviced my farm. She wasn't trying to block my access entirely, that would be clearly illegal, but she was making it functionally impossible for me to operate my farm using the road we'd always used. "Ms. Patterson," I responded, "this proposed regulation would effectively prevent me from accessing my property with the equipment necessary to operate my farm. That undermines the very purpose of the easement." Your easement guarantees access, Mr. Reynolds, not specific types of access, Karen replied with a smug smile. You're welcome to use any vehicle that meets our safety requirements. Now, shall we proceed to a vote? I looked around the room, trying to gauge the reactions of the other residents. A few looked uncomfortable with Karen's tactics, but most seemed either convinced by her presentation or simply uninterested in challenging her. The vote proceeded, with Karen calling for a show of hands. The measure passed 27-8, with most of the no votes coming from an older couple I didn't recognize and a few others who were sitting together. As the meeting wrapped up, I noticed the couple approaching me while Karen was busy accepting congratulations from her supporters. I'm Robert Thompson, and this is my wife Linda, the man said, extending his hand. We voted against that ridiculous regulation. Karen's been running this place like her personal fiefdom since she got elected, and frankly, many of us are getting tired of it. We've lived here for 15 years, Linda added. Your father was always a good neighbor. This isn't right, what they're doing. I thanked them for their support, and as they walked away, I spotted a woman about my age observing our conversation from nearby. She approached after the Thompsons left. Mike Reynolds, Emily Zhang, I don't know if you remember me. We had a few classes together at State. The name clicked immediately. Emily, of course I remember. You were pre-law, right? She nodded. And now I'm post-law, she said with a smile. I specialize in property rights and land use. I've been living in Oak Ridge for about a year now. She lowered her voice. That regulation they just passed? It might have been properly voted on, but that doesn't make it legal. If you have some time, I'd like to talk more about your situation. As we exchanged contact information, I noticed Karen watching us from across the room, her eyes narrowing. Emily saw it too and smiled. Karen and I have history. She made some rather insensitive comments about outsiders at a community meeting last year. I've been waiting for a chance to educate her on a few matters. When I left the meeting, Karen wore a triumphant smile, clearly believing she'd won. But later that evening, as Emily showed me an obscure section of the city code, I realized the issue wasn't the shared road at all. It was how I accessed my farm. And ironically, a portion of Karen's own property might provide the perfect solution to my problem. Emily and I discovered a crucial detail while reviewing my father's meticulously preserved property documents. See this, she said, pointing to an old survey map. There's a second access point at the southwest corner of your property, and it borders Karen's lot. The irony was perfect. This rarely used access point crossed through a corner of Karen's property before connecting to a service road. Emily explained the legal concept of easement by necessity. Since the HOA had blocked my primary access route, I could legally establish a new path through adjacent properties, especially with historical documentation proving its existence. The documentation is solid, she assured me. Your family's property predates the development, and this secondary path is clearly marked in the original surveys. Our planning was interrupted by James Wilson, the HOA vice president, who arrived unexpectedly. Karen's using the HOA to pursue a personal agenda, he explained. It goes back about 5 years, when she tried to broker a deal to get your father to sell this land to a developer. The commission would have been substantial. Your father refused, and Karen never forgave him. When you inherited the farm, I think she saw an opportunity for payback. The revelation explained everything. Karen's hostility wasn't about tractors or property values. It was a grudge against my family over a missed payday. With this knowledge and our newfound legal strategy, Emily and I formulated a plan. The next morning, I received confirmation of a large delivery of fertilizer, seeds, and equipment scheduled for the following week. I immediately called the supplier to redirect the delivery through our newly discovered access point, right past Karen's property. As I finalized the details for 20 tons of organic fertilizer to travel through the corner of Karen's front yard, I couldn't help feeling a surge of satisfaction. This was just the opening move. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Emily helped me prepare the legal documentation for the easement by necessity claim, complete with historical maps, the recent HOA regulation that made my original access unusable for its intended purpose, and a formal notice of intent to exercise my property rights. We had the paperwork notarized and sent official copies to Karen, the HOA board, and filed the appropriate documents with the county clerk's office. Emily explained that while we weren't asking for permission, the formal notification would strengthen our position if Karen tried to challenge us legally. I also hired a local surveyor to mark the exact boundaries of the easement with small flags, creating a clear path for the delivery trucks to follow. The flags traced a neat line through a small corner of Karen's meticulously landscaped front yard, carefully staying within the boundaries identified in the historical documents. The surveyor assured me that his work was precise to within inches, an important detail if Karen tried to claim we were exceeding the easement boundary. The morning of the delivery, I positioned myself discreetly down the street with a clear view of Karen's house. The first truck arrived precisely at 9 a.m., a massive semi hauling organic fertilizer. The driver followed my instructions perfectly, turning onto the service road and then carefully navigating the marked path through the corner of Karen's property. The truck's wheels stayed exactly within the flagged boundaries, but still managed to crush some of her decorative border plants as it passed. I didn't have to wait long for the reaction. Karen burst from her front door in what appeared to be a bathrobe and slippers, her face a mask of outrage as she screamed at the driver. To his credit, he simply handed her a copy of the easement documentation I had provided and continued on his route to my farm. 2 more delivery trucks followed in quick succession, each taking the same path, each driver equipped with the same paperwork. By the 3rd truck, Karen was on her phone, gesticulating wildly. 30 minutes later, Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulled up. I decided it was time to make my appearance and drove over in my pickup. As I approached, I could hear Karen's voice rising over the rumble of the 4th delivery truck, which was now making its way through the easement. "This is trespassing. This is vandalism. I want them arrested immediately," Karen was shouting, her face flushed with anger. "Look at my landscaping. Do you know how much those imported hydrangeas cost?" Sheriff Martinez noticed me walking up and gave a slight nod. "Ms. Patterson, I've reviewed the documentation these drivers have provided, and it appears Mr. Reynolds is exercising a legal easement by necessity. The county records confirm this secondary access point has existed since before Oak Ridge was developed." "That's ridiculous," Karen sputtered. "There has never been any easement through my property. I would have known about it when I purchased this house." I stepped forward. The easement wasn't active before because we had no necessity to use it. But when the HOA passed regulations making our primary access route unusable for farm equipment and deliveries, this secondary access became necessary. It's a well-established legal principle. Easement by necessity. I've filed all the proper documentation with the county. Karen turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "You planned this. You orchestrated this whole thing to destroy my property out of spite." "Not at all," I replied calmly. "I'm simply trying to operate my farm after being blocked from using the access road my family has used for generations. If the HOA would reconsider its weight restrictions on the eastern road, I'd have no need to use this alternative route." Sheriff Martinez stepped between us as Karen seemed ready to launch into another tirade. "Ms. Patterson, Mr. Reynolds appears to be within his legal rights. If you wish to challenge the easement, you'll need to do so through the courts, not by interfering with these deliveries." Karen's next words came through gritted teeth. "Oh, I will be contacting my attorney, you can count on that. And I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting tonight. We'll see how the other homeowners feel about large trucks driving through our neighborhood because of your farming operation." As Karen stormed back to her house, Sheriff Martinez turned to me with a weary expression. "You're playing with fire here, Mike. You may be legally in the right, but Karen has a lot of influence in this community." I nodded. "I understand, Sheriff, but I have to protect my livelihood. All I want is to be able to operate my farm the way my family always has." The sheriff seemed to consider this. Just keep everything by the book, document everything, and maybe consider a security camera or two around your property. Karen's not known for taking defeats gracefully. Throughout the day, the deliveries continued. Word of the situation spread quickly through Oak Ridge, and by afternoon a small crowd of residents had gathered to watch the procession of trucks following the flagged path through the corner of Karen's yard. Some seemed amused by her predicament, while others appeared concerned about the precedent this might set for their own property. That evening I received a call from a reporter with a local news station. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Sarah Johnson from Channel 8 News. We've heard about a situation between your farm and the Oak Ridge HOA. Would you be willing to give us your side of the story?" I hadn't anticipated media attention, but I realized this might be an opportunity to present my case to the broader community. "Yes, I'd be happy to speak with you," I told her. As I hung up the phone, I noticed an email notification on my laptop. It was from James, informing me that Karen had indeed called an emergency HOA meeting for the following evening. The subject line read, "Urgent. Action required. Agricultural invasion of Oak Ridge Estate." The battle lines were drawn, and it seemed our neighborhood dispute was about to get a much wider audience. What Karen didn't realize was that while she was preparing for tonight's skirmish, I had already discovered a document in my father's old files that could change everything about Oak Ridge Estates and the land it sat on. I just needed a little more time to confirm what I'd found. After our initial victory with the delivery trucks, Karen's retaliation was swift and multifaceted. A local news segment featured both of us. I calmly explained my situation with historical documentation, while Karen appeared agitated, making dramatic claims about property values being destroyed and dismissing my legal documents as fabrications. Public opinion on social media strongly favored my position, which only intensified Karen's determination. Within hours, she escalated her attacks by sending an urgent health and safety alert email to all residents, falsely claiming my farm was an environmental hazard contaminating the neighborhood's groundwater. She simultaneously created a Facebook group called Save Oak Ridge from Agricultural Pollution to build outside pressure. Emily immediately recognized these actions as defamation territory and began documenting everything. The most concerning development came when I found a private security guard stationed at the boundary where the delivery trucks had passed. While technically not blocking access, his presence was clearly meant to intimidate. "Just following orders, sir," he said when questioned. At the emergency HOA meeting that evening, Karen presented doctored photographs supposedly showing agricultural contamination flowing from my property. When I addressed the accusations and offered my farm's organic certification records, Karen quickly displayed more misleading images. The tide began to turn when Linda Thompson stood up and proposed postponing any actions until an independent environmental assessment could be conducted. Despite Karen's obvious frustration, the motion passed. Karen's final countermove came at 5:30 the next morning when I discovered her supervising a bulldozer depositing large landscaping rocks directly across the easement path. "I'm improving the landscaping on HOA property," she claimed with a smirk. "There's no rule against beautification projects." Sheriff Martinez arrived, but could only document the obstruction. Removing the boulders would require a court order. Later that day, a time-sensitive seed delivery couldn't reach my farm, causing real financial damage. Exactly the evidence we needed to demonstrate tangible harm from Karen's actions. While preparing our legal response, I discovered something far more significant in my father's old documents. Information about the water supply for the entire Oak Ridge Estates that would provide the leverage we needed. If Karen wanted to play hardball, she was about to learn she wasn't the only one who could disrupt essential services. At the county records office, Emily and I uncovered a bombshell revelation that changed everything about my conflict with the Oak Ridge HOA. "This is absolutely solid," Emily said, pointing to the original development agreements. "The main water supply line for the entire subdivision runs through your property. Your father granted an easement for this infrastructure, but with specific conditions, including maintaining your farm's access rights and receiving reasonable compensation for the utility easement. The implications were staggering. Not only had the payments stopped about 15 years ago, amounting to approximately $37,000 in back fees, but the agreement specified that if terms were violated, such as by restricting my access rights, I had grounds to renegotiate or potentially revoke the utility easement. Oak Ridge's entire water supply depends on an easement agreement that the HOA is currently violating, Emily confirmed. We're not going to threaten to cut off their water, but this gives us significant leverage. We'll document Karen's boulder obstruction, then request a meeting with the full HOA board to discuss both easement issues. James called to warn us that Karen was planning an emergency board meeting to authorize legal action against me. We quickly arranged to meet him and shared our discovery about the water easement. His eyes widened. This changes everything. Most board members have no idea about this history. Later that evening, James texted that the meeting had descended into chaos after he showed our documents. Karen had called him a traitor, but the vote to pursue legal action against me failed, 4-3.3. In retaliation, Karen called for another emergency meeting to address board misconduct and made threats about taking matters into own hands. The next morning, escalation continued when I discovered a fraudulent notice of environmental violation sign at my farm entrance and caught a drone surveilling my property. Hours later, I received an unauthorized cease and desist notice on HOA letterhead, demanding I stop all agricultural operations and pay a $5,000 environmental remediation fee. Emily confirmed it was completely unauthorized and potentially fraudulent. That evening's HOA meeting was packed beyond capacity with news crews outside. Karen attempted to conduct the meeting without James and other dissenting board members, claiming they were temporarily suspended. Residents protested this obvious violation of bylaws. Just as the meeting was descending into chaos, James arrived with the other board members and Sheriff Martinez, declaring the meeting illegitimate. When I stood up to address the crowd, Karen tried to block my access to the microphone. "This is an Oak Ridge residents-only meeting," she snapped. "Actually," I replied calmly, "as the owner of the property that supplies water to every home in this room, I think I have something relevant to contribute." A hush fell over the crowd. I had their attention now. Works for everyone, but it requires good faith negotiation, not false accusations and vigilante tactics. A middle-aged man in the third row raised his hand. "What back payments are you talking about?" Emily stepped forward to answer. According to the original agreement, a modest annual payment was to be made for the utility easement. Based on our review of the records, these payments stopped about 15 years ago when management changed hands. The accumulated amount, with interest, comes to approximately $37,000. This caused another wave of murmurs through the crowd. An older woman stood up. "I've lived in Oak Ridge for 12 years and I never knew our water came through private property. Why hasn't the HOA ever mentioned this to residents?" All eyes turned to Karen, who appeared flustered. This alleged agreement is from decades ago. It's probably not even valid anymore, and regardless, the HOA has full authority to regulate neighborhood roads for safety and aesthetic purposes. Robert Thompson stood up from his seat. "I think we're missing the point here. If what Mr. Reynolds is saying is true, and these documents certainly look legitimate, then our HOA president has been waging a personal vendetta against a neighbor while concealing critical information about our community infrastructure from residents and board members alike." "Exactly," Karen shot back. "A personal vendetta. Reynolds is only bringing this up now because he has a grudge against me for enforcing HOA rules." James cleared his throat. "Actually, Karen, I think Mr. Thompson was suggesting that you're the one with the personal vendetta. Perhaps you should explain to everyone why you've been so determined to target Reynolds' farm. Maybe tell them about the real estate deal that fell through 5 years ago." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "That's completely irrelevant. This is about property values and community standards, not the six-figure commission you lost when Mike's father refused to sell his farm to your developer client," James interrupted. "The same developer who wanted to expand Oak Ridge and promised you exclusive rights to sell all the new properties?" The room fell silent again as all eyes turned to Karen. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. In the quiet, a new voice spoke up from the back of the room. "I think I've heard enough," said a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit who had been observing silently until now. "For those who don't know me, I'm Richard Bancroft, legal counsel for Oak Ridge Estates Management Corporation. Our company oversees 27 HOAs in this county, including Oak Ridge." He walked to the front of the room, nodding politely to me as he passed. "Ms. Patterson, in light of these revelations and the unauthorized actions you've taken without board approval, I need to ask you to step down from the podium." Karen stood frozen, clutching the gavel like a weapon. "You can't remove me. I was elected by the residents." "No one is removing you at this moment," Bancroft replied calmly. "But I am temporarily suspending this meeting until our office can review these documents and the recent board actions. Based on what I've heard tonight, there appear to be serious breaches of HOA bylaws and potentially deliberate misrepresentation to residents." He turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this situation. Our management company takes these matters very seriously. We will be conducting a full investigation into both the water easement agreement and the recent actions taken against Reynolds Farm. In the meantime, all recent regulatory changes regarding road access will be suspended pending review." Karen finally found her voice again. "You can't do that. The board voted. We have rules." "Rules that you've been selectively enforcing and potentially violating," Bancroft responded firmly. "Ms. Patterson, I strongly suggest you refrain from taking any further actions as HOA president until our review is complete. That includes removing any unauthorized signage placed on Mr. Reynolds' property and ceasing any surveillance activities immediately." As the meeting broke up, residents gathered in small groups, discussing the shocking revelations. Several approached me directly, including Linda and Robert Thompson. "We had no idea about any of this," Linda said. "Most of us just want good neighbors and a nice place to live. We're not out to destroy anyone's livelihood." Robert nodded in agreement. "Karen's been running this place like her personal kingdom for too long. Maybe this is the wake-up call the community needed." As I was speaking with the Thompsons, Sheriff Martinez approached with a concerned expression. "Mike, I just got word that there's some kind of commotion at your farm. Apparently, Karen left here about 20 minutes ago, and one of my deputies just reported seeing her vehicle at your property line." Emily and I exchanged alarmed glances and quickly made our excuses to head back to the farm. As we drove, I couldn't help wondering what desperate action Karen might take now that her authority was being challenged so publicly. What we found when we arrived was worse than I had imagined. Karen had apparently decided that if she couldn't block my access legally, she would create a situation that forced authorities to intervene. She had parked her SUV directly across the secondary access path and was in the process of emptying large bags of an unknown substance along the farm perimeter while filming the entire process on her phone. Sheriff Martinez, who had followed us in his patrol car, immediately approached her. "Miss Patterson, what exactly are you doing on Mr. Reynolds' property?" Karen continued filming as she responded. "I'm documenting the environmental contamination coming from this farm. Look at this soil. It's clearly contaminated with agricultural chemicals that are leaching into our groundwater." I noticed the empty bags beside her vehicle, standard garden soil from a local home improvement store. She was staging fake evidence of contamination while creating actual trespassing evidence against herself. "Karen," I said calmly, making sure my voice was picked up by her phone's recording, "you're trespassing on private property and falsifying environmental evidence. That's at least 2 criminal offenses being recorded on your own device." She turned the camera toward me. "You're threatening the health of an entire community. Someone has to protect Oak Ridge when the authorities won't do their job." Her voice had taken on a shrill quality that was genuinely concerning. Sheriff Martinez stepped between us. "Ms. Patterson, I need you to stop what you're doing immediately and step away from Mr. Reynolds' property line." "Do you taking his side too?" Karen demanded, her camera now pointed at the sheriff. "Is everyone in this county on his payroll? What happened to protecting tax-paying citizens?" The sheriff maintained his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, this has nothing to do with taking sides. You are currently trespassing and potentially falsifying evidence. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me now." For a moment I thought Karen might actually try to flee or resist. Instead, she suddenly seemed to deflate, the manic energy draining from her body. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, looking directly at me. "All of you will." She allowed the sheriff to escort her to his patrol car while a deputy moved her SUV. As they drove away, Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. "This isn't over yet," she warned. "That was a very public meltdown, but Karen strikes me as someone who doesn't give up easily." I nodded, surveying the mess she'd left behind. "At least now everyone can see what we've been dealing with. I just hope the HOA management company is serious about resolving this fairly." "Speaking of which," Emily said, checking her phone, "I just got an email from Richard Bancroft. He wants to meet with us tomorrow morning to discuss a potential resolution." She looked up with a slight smile. "I think the tide might finally be turning in our favor." What neither of us realized was that while Karen's public battle against me was faltering, she had been quietly working on a different angle, one that would lead to the most surprising revelation of all. The meeting with Richard Bancroft was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Oak Ridge Estates Management Office, a sleek building in the commercial district downtown. Emily and I arrived 15 minutes early, prepared with all our documentation and a clear set of reasonable requests. Restore my farm's traditional access rights, remove all fraudulent violation notices, and establish clear boundaries for future HOA interactions with my property. We were shown into a conference room where, to my surprise, James and the other HOA board members were already seated, minus Karen, of course. Bancroft joined us moments later, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Angela Morrison, the county's chief surveyor. "Thank you all for coming," Bancroft began once we were settled. "Before we discuss the easement issues, Ms. Morrison has some information that I believe everyone should hear. Her office has been conducting a comprehensive property line reassessment for tax purposes, and her findings are directly relevant to our situation." Morrison opened a laptop and connected it to a display screen on the wall. "We've been updating the county's GIS mapping system using modern GPS technology, which is significantly more accurate than the survey methods used when Oak Ridge Estates was initially developed." She pulled up a detailed map showing the boundary between my farm and the subdivision. "During this process, we discovered some significant discrepancies between the recorded property lines and the actual boundaries." She zoomed in on a section that I immediately recognized as the area around Karen's property. "This red line shows the property boundary as recorded in the original deeds and HOA documents. The blue line shows the actual boundary based on our new survey. The two lines diverged considerably at certain points, with the most dramatic difference occurring right at Karen's backyard. As you can see," Morrison continued, "approximately 1,200 square feet of what is currently being used as private backyards by Oak Ridge residents, primarily Lot 42, which I believe belongs to Ms. Patterson, is actually located on Reynolds Farm property, according to the original land deeds and our new survey." A stunned silence fell over the room. James was the first to find his voice. "Are you saying that part of Karen's backyard, including her swimming pool and garden, is actually on Mike's land?" Morrison nodded. "Based on our assessment, yes. The discrepancy appears to have originated from an error in the initial development survey. The builder used incorrect boundary markers when establishing the lot lines." I sat back in my chair processing this revelation. All this time, while Karen had been fighting to keep my tractor off her roads, she had been unknowingly trespassing on my property with her prized swimming pool and elaborate garden, improvements that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Bancroft cleared his throat. Obviously, this complicates matters significantly. Legally, Mr. Reynolds would be within his rights to demand removal of all structures and improvements from his property, though that would be an extensive and disruptive process. Emily and I exchanged glances. I already knew what I wanted to do, and her slight nod confirmed she was thinking along the same lines. I have no interest in forcing Karen or anyone else to tear down existing structures, I said. I'm not looking to create hardship for my neighbors. All I've ever wanted was to be able to operate my farm without interference. That's very generous, Bancroft replied, looking relieved. What are you proposing? A long-term easement agreement? I suggested. The affected homeowners can continue using the land as they have been in exchange for restoring my farm's traditional access rights, dropping all the recent regulations targeting my operations, and updating the water utility easement agreement with fair compensation moving forward. James and the other board members nodded approvingly. That seems more than reasonable, James said. And regarding the back payments for the water easement, I considered this for a moment. I'm willing to waive the back payments if the HOA agrees to formally acknowledge my property rights, retract all false claims about environmental violations, and establish a cooperative relationship moving forward. Maybe form a joint committee of farm and HOA representatives to address any legitimate concerns without resorting to confrontation. Bancroft seemed impressed. Mr. Reynolds, that's an extraordinarily fair proposal. I believe I can speak for the management company in saying we fully support this approach. He turned to the board members. Would the HOA be amenable to these terms? Before anyone could respond, the conference room door burst open and Karen strode in, followed by a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Don't agree to anything, she announced. I've hired an attorney to fight this fraudulent land grab. The atmosphere in the room immediately tensed. Bancroft stood. Mrs. Patterson, this is a private meeting. You are currently suspended from your HOA duties pending review of your conduct. I'm here as a homeowner whose property is being threatened, Karen snapped, and I have every right to defend myself against these baseless claims. The man beside her stepped forward. Richard Henderson, representing Ms. Patterson. My client rejects any assertion that her property encroaches on Reynolds Farm land and demands an independent survey before any agreements are reached. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Mr. Henderson, I am the county's chief surveyor. Our office has no stake in this dispute, and our findings are based on the original property deeds and state-of-the-art GPS mapping. Would you like to review our methodology? Henderson hesitated, clearly not expecting to encounter the actual county surveyor. Karen, however, wasn't deterred. This is all a setup. Reynolds has been planning this for years, manipulating records to steal my property after I stood up to his agricultural invasion of our community. I couldn't help but laugh, which only seemed to infuriate Karen further. Karen, until yesterday I had no idea your swimming pool was on my land. I've never had any interest in your backyard. All I've ever wanted was to be left alone to run my farm the way my family always has. Lies, Karen hissed. You've had it out for me ever since I'd tried to protect our community's property values by enforcing legitimate HOA regulations. James stood up. Karen, that's enough. The board has reviewed the evidence, including your unauthorized actions taken without board approval. We've also learned about your conflict of interest regarding the failed land development deal with Mike's father. He looked around at his fellow board members who nodded in support. As vice president, I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in your leadership. Karen's face flushed. You can't do that without a full HOA meeting. Actually, Bancroft interjected, according to your bylaws, the board can remove an officer for cause with a 2/3 majority vote. Given the evidence of unauthorized actions, misuse of HOA resources, and undisclosed conflicts of interest, I believe they have ample cause. The vote was quick and unanimous. Karen was officially removed as HOA president, with James appointed as interim president until a proper election could be held. Henderson, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quietly advised Karen that they should discuss matters privately before proceeding further. After Karen and her attorney left, the atmosphere in the room lightened considerably. We spent the next hour working out the details of a comprehensive agreement that would resolve all outstanding issues between my farm and Oak Ridge Estates. The HOA would rescind all recently passed regulations targeting farm equipment and access. I would grant formal easements to the affected homeowners whose properties extended onto my land with nominal annual fees. The water utility easement would be updated with fair compensation moving forward. A community liaison committee would be formed to address any future concerns collaboratively. All fraudulent violation notices would be formally retracted, and the HOA would issue a public apology for the false claims. When I returned to my farm that afternoon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could focus on farming without worrying about what new obstacle Karen might throw in my path. I pulled my father's old tractor out of the barn and drove it along the eastern access road, the same road my family had always used, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction that justice had finally prevailed. Over the following weeks, the situation with Oak Ridge Estates transformed dramatically. James proved to be an excellent HOA president, focused on building community rather than enforcing arbitrary rules. The liaison committee we established actually resulted in some valuable collaborations. Several residents expressed interest in learning about sustainable agriculture, which led to a small community garden program on an unused corner of my property. As for Karen, her public meltdown and removal as HOA president seemed to trigger some genuine self-reflection. After the initial shock wore off, she approached me one day as I was working near our property line. On my side, of course. "I've been unfair to you," she admitted, clearly struggling with the words. "I let my personal disappointment over that old real estate deal cloud my judgment. And I may have overreacted a bit." That was the understatement of the century, but I appreciated the effort it must have taken her to say even that much. "Water under the bridge," I replied. "How's your garden coming along this season?" She seemed surprised by the question. "Actually, I've been having trouble with my tomatoes. The leaves keep turning yellow no matter what I do." "Sounds like a magnesium deficiency. I have some organic supplements that might help if you're interested." That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected détente. Karen never became friendly exactly, but she developed a grudging respect for my farming knowledge, especially after my advice saved her prized tomato plants. She even joined the community garden program, though she insisted on having her own separate plot to experiment with different techniques. The following spring, I finally completed the modernization projects that had been delayed by all the HOA drama. As I drove my tractor along the freshly graveled access road, I noticed Karen in her garden, planting her tomatoes for the new season. I gave a friendly wave, which she acknowledged with a slight nod. Progress by her standards. Sometimes the best victory isn't crushing your opponent, but turning them into a reluctant ally. Karen still lives in Oak Ridge, no longer HOA president, but possibly the neighborhood's best tomato grower thanks to my advice. As for me, I still drive my old tractor along the familiar road, occasionally waving to the neighbors who once viewed it as an eyesore, but now see it as part of the community's character. The lesson here: never mess with a farmer who understands the law, and definitely don't build a swimming pool before checking your property boundaries.